Hi, everyone. Forgot to mention when we started this morning that tomorrow's tax day, which I feel like is kind of a committee holiday. And so I want to take a moment to acknowledge that tomorrow's tax day. Congratulate you all on the great work we've done leading up to tax day.
Are you going to give us tomorrow off?
Yes, everyone has tomorrow off in honor of tax day.
And technically, it's Monday this year.
Sure, but the 15th is the, you also,
Actually, Monday night with Patriots Day.
also, what is Patriots Day?
That's right. Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Right, that's when they have the marathon.
We don't live in Massachusetts, and so tomorrow,
18.
you can have tomorrow off and you can have Monday off in honor of tax day. And with that, we're going to go back to childcare. Thank you very much, Morgan, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Yours.
Sure. Good morning. For the record, I'm Dr. Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director of Building Bright Futures, which is Vermont's Early Childhood State Advisory Council. Because this is my first time in this committee this year, I just want to give a brief overview of the role that Building Bright Futures has in the system, and then talk a little bit about data-driven decision-making with your committee as we're preparing for significant systems change. And then I will be here to support questions and really open the floor to say, how can I best support you? So the documents that I provided you include that overview, a ton of resources and data that we already have on the system. I'm not going to use that as verbatim talking points, but they're there if you want to ask some questions or if there are things you want to follow up on. So the first thing I want to talk with you about is our role in the system. We are charged under Title 33, Chapter 46, and the Federal Head Start Act as the primary advisor to the governor and the legislature on the well-being of children and families prenatal to age 8. And what that means in practice is maintaining and monitoring the strategic plan for Vermont's early childhood system. It means that we have a very robust infrastructure at multiple levels that includes 12 regional councils that touches every corner of the state. We have 7 strategic plan committees to monitor progress towards the vision we've set for the system. And we have a state advisory council, which is 23 governor-appointed members, and it is a public-private partnership. And what that means is we are a nonpartisan, independent, data-driven entity. Our board has all of the different departments, divisions, and agencies responsible for supporting kids and families, as well as a member from the House and the Senate, and family members, as well as private partners. So we operate by making sure that we are in that independent space. So we are not allowed to advocate. We don't make any specific support or proposals of specific bills. And instead our role is really to say, what do we know from families and communities across the state about the needs and challenges? We use our regional councils for that as a really important mechanism to say, across all of the areas of the state, where is there regional variation in the needs? Where is there kind of systematic challenges where we're hearing the same thing from all of the different parts of the state of Vermont? And those partners across those regions are coming together to say, here are the needs, here are the challenges, and developing sometimes regional strategies that can be scaled, and other times are elevating it to say, hey, state of Vermont, we need to create change together. So that first role is really around lifting up and, again, elevating family and community voice. Another critical role we play is using the most up-to-date, high-quality data to inform decision-making and making sure that people have access to that data and what it means. So on an annual basis, we produce a report called The State of Vermont's Children. It's a retrospective look at the past year. What do we know about the system of services, all of the resources and supports for kids and families? What do we know about outcomes for kids and families at that point in time? Some of that data is longitudinal, some of it's not. It's really to provide a snapshot of how we're doing in that moment. And then guiding policy change for our legislative leaders, for the governor and the administration. The role also is around accountability. How do we make sure that we are, as we're working towards the vision we've set for the system, holding our partners across that public and private divide accountable to that vision? The vision that we've set is that the early childhood system will be an integrated, continuous, comprehensive, high-quality system that's equitable, accessible, and will improve outcomes for children and families prenatal through age 8. Any questions about the role of Building Bright Futures before I talk about the data?
If we wanted to attend one of our regional council meetings, what would be the best way to?
I am happy to provide you the full list of all of the regional managers who support and facilitate those meetings. They are open to the public. Every meeting that we hold at Building Bright Futures is open to the public. Most of them are happening virtually as well. So it's not as if you have to be in that region to attend that meeting nor the State Advisory Council. So I can send you a list of the regional managers and the webpage where it says when those meetings are.
Thanks.
Any other questions about Building Bright Futures?
What's your relationship with Let's Grow Kids?
Oh, great question. So that question we get often. And what I would say is that Let's Grow Kids is a key component of advocacy around building a strong childcare system in Vermont. And they have a very specific mission as an organization. They also build the capacity of the state in different ways around childcare capacity and supporting some of the data work around early childhood education for the state. And while we partner with them, and Let's Grow Kids has traditionally in the past held a seat on our board on the State Advisory Council, one of the major differences is that their work is specific to childcare. Building Bright Futures work is the broad early childhood system, which means every resource and sector that is supporting kids and families. It may be health, nutrition, mental health, housing, special education, early childhood education, really thinking about the broad needs of kids and families. And our role, again, is not advocacy. It's to say, how can we provide the best data and information to inform and advise you all as decision makers in the system?
Thanks.
Sure. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about data-driven decision-making. And there's been extensive work done in Vermont's early childhood system to prepare for the investments that we are talking about in this session related to early childhood systems change. And when I say significant, I'm talking about the last couple of decades building the wealth of understanding. So in our system, we have a really strong understanding of the needs, the barriers, and the challenges in our system. We have reports like the State of Vermont's Children that have an annual snapshot. We have a document that was produced in 2020 called the Early Childhood Needs Assessment. That document is produced periodically, usually 3 to 5 years, to have a kind of more comprehensive meta-analysis and additional feedback to understand the needs, again, at one point in time. But then we also have that continuous monitoring of the needs on the ground through our regional councils and our strategic plan committees. And what we've found is that the themes haven't changed on the needs of our kids and families or the system. So all of this data through both numbers and then qualitative data from the voices of communities and stakeholder engagement is coming up with those same themes from the Blue Ribbon Commission, the Building Vermont's Future from the Child Up. We need to be focused on equitable access, quality, workforce, accountability and high quality data, and then resources and funding, because we know from all of this work, our system's chronically underfunded. And again, that comprehensive stakeholder engagement continues to be one of the most important mechanisms for how we are monitoring this body of work. So in addition to the long-standing data we have on the needs of kids and families, we also know that Vermont's legislature commissioned 2 studies in the last couple of years that are really important for folks to understand. The first study was to examine the systems that currently govern early childhood education. And the second study was the cost. What does it cost to build a high quality system, and what are the financing mechanisms? So that first study, the legislature tasked Building Bright Futures with overseeing and facilitating a systems analysis, where we brought in national experts to come into the state of Vermont and do some very rigorous stakeholder engagement for a year, so that we could, again, identify what those needs and challenges were related to both the needs of kids and families, but also the system and the mechanisms of how we are governing and administering programs. So they reviewed over 80 documents and reports. So when I say that robust 10 years, decades of information, we provided them 80 reports and documentation. And they conducted interviews with over 100 early childhood stakeholders, focus groups, the regional councils, and our strategic plan committees. And they provided a series of recommendations around how we transform governance. So that's the first one. And then the second was the study under, again, Act 45 called the Vermont Early Care and Education Financing Study that was overseen by the Joint Fiscal Office, and RAND was the contractor for that body of work. And what's really important about that piece is that they were estimating the cost of what it truly means to have a high quality early childhood education system in Vermont, and then developing the mechanisms for how we get there. So I think what's important for you all to hear about that body of research is we have formal data collection, we have analysis, we have vast stakeholder engagement across the system, and we have national experts helping support that evaluation and examination of what our system needs. And at this point, we have the results of those two studies. And it's really the responsibility of us as leaders across the state, as the legislature and the administration, to use that data and those recommendations to create the change. And I think our policy committees have worked hard to really consider that large body of research and evidence, as well as all of the solutions that were proposed to develop the series of bills that you all have been reviewing, or at least the most recent iteration of those bills. I think one of the other pieces around data-driven decision-making that's important for the committee is there are so many different settings in which kids and families are served. And it's a complex system, but we have a lot of data on this body of work and what we know about that mixed delivery system. So in the materials that I provided you, there's data in there about the current status of that system. There's information on enrollment, the capacity within the different domains of the system. And then the other piece of information that I provided to you all is one of our formal SAC meetings from February. We brought partners together and said, okay, there's a series of bills that were just introduced. What are your questions? What are you excited about? What are you concerned about? What questions do you have? And how do we capture that in a truly meaningful way? So we did that both publicly at the State Advisory Council meeting, but then we also provided anonymous opportunities for feedback. And within 1 week, we had over 200 responses around this bill, both what's really exciting and then the questions. And we've provided that, all of that information, both to this committee, but primarily to the policy committees to say, here's what stakeholders want you to know about this bill and where there's transformative change and where there's opportunities for improvement. So you also have access to the themes. We summarized that and provided it to our legislative leaders as well as the administration to understand, what are the questions that folks have and where is their real excitement. So I'm not going to go through all of those pieces, but really just want to make sure that you have access to that information, and would leave you with a couple of high level things to consider as you're moving forward with this bill, which is implementation. What does it truly take to implement this study, and making sure that we are thinking about setting appropriate benchmarks, not just 1 year out, but how are we making sure that we are holding the system accountable over time and setting the feasible, appropriate benchmarks for what this looks like at 1, 5, 10, and 20 years, because systems change is complex. And the work that this body as a whole has done this year is really talking about transformative change, which is amazing. So how do we now make sure that we have appropriate benchmarks and that we are monitoring that change over time? I'm going to pause to see what questions folks have, and if there are things that you want more information on, or if there are any data elements that you really want to hear about.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me what is meant by mixed delivery system?
Great question. Yes. So when we're talking about mixed delivery, it is considered national best practice for making sure that families have the ability to access care and education in settings that meet their needs. So when we're talking about high quality early childhood education settings, it might be in a private or a home-based childcare setting. It might be in a public school. It might be in a Head Start program, but that there are a range of options and ways to provide high quality early childhood education, and that families' needs vary. And so the mixed delivery model is seen as this national best practice for how we provide the opportunities that Vermont kids and families need, and that is something valuable to Vermont because we are a rural state and the geographic needs of families is different based on where they live.
Sam Simpson, then Brannigan.
Just follow up with that, have that mixed delivery model for 5. I understand that part of what we're contemplating is whether that gets moved down to 4 and that we're having 4 and up in our public school system. Do you all have perspective? So like, how do we balance mixed delivery system to meet the needs of all families and a kind of consistent public education delivery?
Yes.
And at what age do we cross from one to the other?
Great question. So yes, our current mixed delivery system is really looking at prenatal to age 5 or 4-year-olds and then 5-year-olds not yet eligible for kindergarten, right? And my understanding of where the current bill is today in the House Human Services Committee is that they are really intending to maintain the mixed delivery model for kids under the age of 5, but that the vision is that public schools offer the opportunity to have children have pre-K within the public schools and to maintain the ability to contract with private programs to be able to support that mixed delivery lens to meet the needs of kids and families. So my understanding right now is there's still intent around maintaining that mixed delivery model. There's a lot of work from an implementation perspective over the next couple of years to actually transform from what we have now to that model. But that is the current conceptualization.
And can you just explain a little bit more about the kind of intent behind that approach? Is it to ensure that like all kids have equitable access to a consistent level of universal pre-K in all of our communities and complement that with additional options for families who seek to take advantage of those? Or
I couldn't have said it better. Yes. So my understanding is that they what they're trying to do is build equitable access to high quality learning opportunities in every corner of the state. And right now, what we know is that 10 hours a week of universal pre-K, regardless of what setting it is in, is not enough for kids and families. Go ahead.
And that right now, some communities are doing 10 hours, so 3 half days a week, and other communities are doing full day, 5 days a week in public settings, and that leads to really different levels of access from one community to another.
Yes, there's absolutely variability in how this approach is implemented statewide, where some school districts in some parts of the state do have the opportunity to provide a larger number of hours based on the way they're running the programs. There are public schools who are already offering pre-K. There are private programs. So we really do have this important mixed delivery model, but that it's not equitable for a range of reasons, whether it's transportation, whether it's the number of hours and who has access based on geography. And there's a whole body of work that's been done to talk about all of those challenges and how to move that body of work forward. But I think the consensus is 10 hours a week is not enough. Mixed delivery is an important intention to maintain. And now the opportunity is how do we think about implementation over the next several years?
And my question is, does any of that best practice data, the newly acquired research data, show that these delivery models can be delivered at home, within the context of the home? Or is it in another place other than the home?
Can you clarify for me when you say in the home, meaning a home-based childcare center versus or with a parent providing that education within the home? Great question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm happy to talk with some of our national colleagues who are doing work in all of these areas. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, they must be able to evaluate children's progress in grades 1 through 3 and then compare that to what they had for preschool instruction. If it was home-based, I mean, in a home with their mother or with a nanny, or if it was preschool as a 5-year-old or preschool as a 4 and 5-year-old. They must have that data.
Yeah, so it's such a great question, and it speaks to the need for longitudinal data on children and families and what they have access to and when, and how that impacts their outcomes in third grade, right? So it might be ready for kindergarten. It might be in Vermont's terms and how we are currently measuring, what are third grade math and reading scores? What do those things look like? And could we look at what they had access to in their early learning experience and see what that trajectory was? Right now, we have the ability to do that with our modeling, and we still have broad population-based outcomes. And so that's why I would say that's really a question from some of our national partners who do have access to some longitudinal data that may not be Vermont specific, but could give us a sense of what that looks like, either across the country or within some studies that they have done in states similar to Vermont.
And you know, in Vermont, it looks like we have about 5,000 children at each level, at each 5,000 3-year-olds, 5,000 4-year-olds. That's about what we have. So is that enough kids to draw a statistically valid conclusion on anything?
Great question. I love when people talk about statistics and data. That is an area that I love. And because I don't have access to the exact data, and the state also isn't looking necessarily at those trajectories in this moment, I would say it's hard for me to know what would reach the level of statistical significance, but there's absolutely evidence that we can draw on from what we're seeing in trends and what we know from the broad population data. It's just, and I should also say, there's some really important qualitative data that speaks to this as well, right? It's not always just about that number and whether or not we're reaching statistical significance, but what else do we know and what information supports our ability when we do have small numbers?
Representative Maslin?
Yeah, in answer to your question, Carolyn, I think your question was, what can we learn, basically, I'm rephrasing it, from kids who are at home with stay-at-home parents? You know, how successful or less, where they
Yes.
fall on a scale.
I would love to know that.
And well, I suspect that is determined in large part on what is actually happening at the home, whether parents are good teachers with their kids or whether some of them are hard. And I can give you examples of both. And so the short answer is, I don't know if you could, following your question about statistical reliability, what we could conclude.
Especially if you're.
Could I just also add that, I think it's sort of the context of the environment and parents and also kids, right? Like, I have 2 kids, they could not be more different from each other and they have different needs from their environment. And so what might be the ideal for one kid may or may not be the same for another. And I think that's what I really appreciate about our commitment to a mixed delivery system, is that we're having a variety of options and choices and hopefully making them available and accessible to everyone regardless of income, so that we can match kids and their families with the right educational and emotional support systems to help them develop to their best
We
potential.
need to be able to do that in this public school system. And you know what, someplace a while back, at least 10 years ago, I read that a child's success in school is most dependent on the mother's educational level. So if the mother has a 4-year degree in college, the kid is much more likely to be successful, to be reading by 3rd grade, and to experience success at each level of grade school. But I don't know if that's still true. It was back then.
And degree may have
Maybe Mark can
relationship to
answer that.
So I really appreciate the line of inquiry here because what you're saying is there are so many different factors that support optimal outcomes for development for a child and for that family that sets the stage for their trajectory in life. And yes, a child is situated within their family first. And then they are within their community and the broader system that supports them. So there are absolutely factors that will support optimal development, like the interaction they have with their primary caregivers and the people that they are consistently surrounded by. which is why there's such an emphasis on developing the most high quality early learning experiences, wherever that might be for the child and the family. And I think that that's what mixed delivery offers, right? Is that sometimes it's in home-based childcares. I have not seen that research on what it looks like to provide home-based learning for a child in this model, but I do think that it's important to know that that will vary, again, based on the experience that that child and that family has and the resources that they are able to bring to that.
Can you talk, I appreciated that you sort of clarified that Building Bright Future sort of looks at the whole early childhood system rather than just provision of childcare. And I'm curious to learn more about how you think of early care and education settings and opportunities as a way of sort of strengthening the overall experience of a child, even within their home, how early care and education sort of supports the home environment as well, especially, high quality, affordable, accessible childcare.
Yeah, it's such a great question because again, these things aren't always linear, right? We're creating settings to best meet the needs of kids and families, but then our kids are going back home. And so I do think that there is an opportunity for a child to have the opportunity to be in a high quality setting, whatever that might look like. If it's a Head Start program, if it is a public school, if it's a childcare, private or home based, and that can also support that child development regardless of that home-based setting and actually help support that child's optimal development. But also that what we see across the mixed delivery system is the opportunity to engage with parents in and across those settings. So for example, you will see providers who are identifying, for example, a concern in a child's development and then have to meet with the families and actually engage and understand what are these child's needs and how do we support them in the home and in those settings. And that is true, again, regardless of where that child is, and that there are a range of people, whether it's a pediatrician, an educator, a parent, someone else in the community who may say, okay, there's a concern in this child's development. How do we wrap them in support and get them support and intervention as early as possible? So I think that that's also a benefit for families to have access to early childhood educators, to a range of people who have the ability to partner with them. And that partnership is what's really important. It should never be just that we're transferring knowledge to a parent saying, here's how you do something. When, to your point, families are that first most important teacher. They know and understand the needs of kids. And then, the optimal way is that our system and the providers and the educators are partnering with families to best meet the needs of kids. Go ahead.
One more comment, and this has been bugging me in recent years, but so my kids are your age. 2 have PhDs in chemistry, and the third one has an MBA. I'm so proud of them. They went to public school. I actually did preschool at home. We called it craft time, but it wasn't craft, it was preschool. But they went to public school, and then they all went to college, and they all went to graduate school. But I got to stay home for 20 years. The world has changed, and both my daughters are working now, and my daughter-in-law plans to not work when she has children. So the world has changed. So how can we best adapt to that in rural communities where we're still paying off our school building that was built 30 years ago in my hometown?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how schools will pay for it. And I don't really even know what needs we need to focus on in our community. So we have, our classes are 50 or 60 kids each. It's not a lot of kids, but.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that across the board, the needs of families and communities are changing. Our workforce is changing. The demographics are changing. And I think understanding that in Vermont, our communities across the state also have different needs and that we need to be adaptable and flexible to meet them differently while also having some standardization in how we are providing support is important. But I think one of the things I heard you say is that families are making choices about what their what their work situations look like, what the settings that their children are in, and that's changing. And so I think that that's another reason where having a mixed delivery system that best meets the needs of children and families, and that they're able to make that choice based on those needs is important. I also think that your question is very large, and that we are working hard to identify those ever-changing needs. And one of the ways that we're planning on doing that is through a federal grant that Vermont received in the last 4 months now. It's called the Preschool Development Grant, where we were awarded as a state $23 million to examine the infrastructure, to continuously identify those needs, and to really potentially develop a replicable needs assessment. So right now, all of our data lives in silos within different departments, divisions, agencies, and we're doing our best to compile it. That's a key role that Building Bright Futures plays for the system. But how can we standardize how we are capturing needs? And I think that our network does a great job of that. And we need to also have some systematic ways of saying, here are the needs and how are we adapting to meet those needs, and being as flexible as we can, recognizing there's limitations to resources.
Any other questions?
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about some of the feedback that you got on the polls. And that's a big
Sure.
part of your presentation, and love to hear your take on some of
Sure.
that, and particularly around the concerns of smaller programs that work with younger kids sort of being left out.
Sure. I am happy to talk about this. And so if any of you are looking at the document that we submitted for testimony, some of the hard numbers that I was talking about start on page 3 and 4. And then once you get down into page 5, that is where we started outlining all of the themes that we heard.
I hope I'm not jumping ahead.
No, this is great. I want this to be what you need it to be. So I provided the information, but now you tell me what's helpful. So on page 5 of this testimony doc, what you'll see is that, again, we did this really interesting information gathering, both through the State Advisory Council, but also anonymous feedback. And what we did within a week was take those 200 responses and use some qualitative coding methodology to come up with themes. So what we've provided you is both those themes, but also the raw data. So you can see verbatim in an anonymous way what people said about different parts of these bills. And I think what's important to note is that the bills have changed since the original feedback based on the feedback, which I think is really, really important for folks to hear, not just the committee, but for all of the people who are providing feedback through the network.
For the people providing feedback to know that, then it's
Exactly.
actually for the committee to know.
Right? Like for those of you who are listening at home, right? That the policy and the legislation is changing based on your feedback. So what we captured were around 12 themes from what we heard from stakeholders. And if you're looking at this as I'm speaking, the number that's on the left side is the number of times we heard that type of feedback. The title and what's underlined is how we've named the theme. And then there's a little bit of information to conceptualize that theme. So the first theme that we heard was about financial impacts on private programs. What you will notice as I move through this is that there's a lot of excitement around some pieces, and there were questions around the pre-K component, specifically around mixed delivery. So this is one of those areas where providers and programs were saying, we're worried and we have questions about what this will do to impact our private programs. There are questions about the true cost of care for infants and toddlers, and how this might change an entire business model for some of those private programs who generally are serving children 0 to 5, sometimes 0 to 6, and what it would mean to move 4-year-olds and remove them from those settings. And so the concern that came through was this destabilizes private programs. The second theme was around concerns about removing mixed delivery from pre-K altogether. You heard me talk a little bit about mixed delivery, but the concern is that it would limit choice for families, and that we'd be moving away from national best practice for providing high quality services in a range of settings for children. Some big questions about the capacity and infrastructure of our public schools, right? So you heard me talk a little bit about benchmarks, and as we're thinking about any transformative change, what does implementation look like, and how are we making sure that we are not rushing that process and making sure that we are building what we need to? So from that capacity and infrastructure of public schools, there are questions around their current capacity to serve 4-year-olds in a safe, developmentally appropriate way. And what the actual infrastructure needs would need to be of the schools. So I'm sure that you have all been hearing from other partners and seeing reports about the current infrastructure needs of the education system across the state, specifically our public schools, but also what would need to transition to accommodate 4-year-olds in that space and in those spaces, including, the needs of indoor and outdoor space, playgrounds, classrooms, transportation, startup costs, the timelines, and really ensuring quality. Another theme, and please interrupt me if you have questions about any of these. The next theme was around quality and developmentally appropriate practice. And the question was around our current way that we measure quality through the the STARS, or the Quality Rating Improvement System for the state of Vermont, and the Vermont Early Learning Standards, and how those things might need to shift or be adapted based on any of these changes. And concerns about the loss of play-based learning. Another really exciting piece for folks is around CCFAP. How are we increasing eligibility? How are we building quality in the childcare space and what this means? How are we compensating our workforce? How are we making sure that we are again increasing equitable access and quality at the same time through our CCFAP program? There's a bucket in and of itself on pre-K, because this came through so strongly, that there is excitement about expanding access to pre-K. We know 10 hours is not enough. We are excited about expanding pre-K, and we have concerns about only doing it for 4-year-olds, concerns about what happens to 3-year-olds no longer having access, and what it means for Head Start programs and how that model is represented in this bill.
Can I go back and ask you a question about the STARS program? So I've seen a lot of, we've heard a little bit, maybe from Jenna yesterday. And then I know some versions of the bill have sort of changes in how programs are compensated depending on their quality level. And one proposal I've seen is sort of an incentive payment where after a program does this good work to improve, then they get a grant for doing that. And I'm curious about the idea of incentivizing something after rather than before, where you're giving the resources to get it done.
Great question. And I will say very concretely that I'm not the best person to answer that.
Okay.
But the Senate bill, S56, when it transitioned, did have that model that you're describing. And what I would say is it's
The model of doing the money after.
the bonuses, yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's my understanding. But I think it's a good question to ask Janet, our current deputy commissioner of CDD, about what this looks like and her perceptions as someone who has been really involved in monitoring this even before she was in. Thanks. Sure.
I just want to say that those three concerns that you got the most feedback about are absolutely the ones that are the biggest for me too. And I know for the people in my district, and I serve a very rural district with lousy roads, and we have, the towns do the best job they can with. Certainly this time of year, they're not the greatest, but a lot of dirt roads in my district. But we have really, and I think Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin's testimony yesterday and her county by county sheets just absolutely confirmed everything that I already knew. We're underserved. We've got this very, very cobbed together, tenuous little situation now that still doesn't, it works for a few families. For most people, it doesn't. But I just hate to see it get worse before it gets better. And I think that's my biggest concern in all of this. And I so feel for those families in my district who are just, they're just at their wits' end. And not just around the money piece, but around the what what's available to them, and providers come and go and can't make a go of it and aren't able to make a business of it. And I'm just hoping that what we put together here has some flexibility until we get to a point where the system is running solidly.
Yeah, absolutely fair concerns. And, it is helpful that, again, what we're able to do at Building Bright Futures is elevate the voice of the collective and to be able to bring those themes and have them feel like they are resonating with you all and that you have heard these from your people.
Those three that you listed at the top, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And separately, as someone who lives on the side of a mountain in Heinsberg, I understand where you're coming from on the dirt roads, and shout out to Heinsberg for doing an amazing job this year. Here's what I would say about some of the other data that's not reflected in the themes, but in the table, which is we know there's an issue with equitable access. We know that we have challenges providing care for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. We know that after school and out of school time care, and I'll talk about this in the themes in a minute, that, we have a current number of enrollment, but we're not meeting estimated demand in some of these areas. And so a part of our responsibility is to, make sure that we are understanding those needs and what the demand is, and then creating the spaces to make sure that we're meeting the need equitably for every child in the state. Is it helpful to give a little bit more of the themes? Is that? Yeah. Great.
And I think what you just said is the most important thing to me, meeting the needs equitably of every child. That's my biggest worry, being sort of out in the sticks. I come to Montpelier and people, I used to live in Washington, I live in Corinth now. They'd say, where are you from? I'd say Washington. They'd say DC or state. No, just on the other side of Barrie. So, it's woods out there, and it's hard. It's harder. It's really easy for these rural parts of the state to be forgotten when we put these programs together.
Were you going to say something, or should we continue on that? Go ahead.
I mean, just sort of pulling the thread and Rep. Regan's before, we just want to say really clearly that, so grateful that you were able to stay home for 20 years and to, provide that level of support for your family. And I know other folks in my community who are doing that and want to make sure that we can support families that want to make that choice. And I also know folks who wish they could, but the system, where as Representative Owen was talking about yesterday, make it difficult. And I guess I also want to say, I'm really glad I can be here. I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and know that I am, and you all may or may not agree that you're glad I'm here, but I love this job and the ways that I think I can contribute to my family and my community by being here. And, you all met my beautiful husband, and, he's a part of why I'm here, but it's also the incredibly high quality childcare that I'm able to access in my community. And, glad that we're continuing this conversation about how do we make it work in every corner and for whatever way a family wants to choose. We want to make sure that everyone has choices to make what they think is right for them. And, know that for some that is staying home with their kids. And for me, that's a different path. And I'm glad I get to be here because of the Child Care Center that, I have full faith and confidence they're doing an incredible job with my kids right now, and that they hopefully will be able to access a master's program too. And in part it's because of Sarah and the way she's hanging out with my kids right now.
All right. So one of the other major themes that came up related to these bills is how do we make sure, to the point of equitable access and meeting the needs of every child, that we are also addressing the needs of children with disabilities and special health care needs, and what that looks like across the state. Specifically thinking about the placement for children on individualized education plans, IEPs, which is what's required once you identify a concern. And under the age of 3, that is overseen by the Child Development Division and Early Intervention Programming and the Children's Integrated Services Programming. Once a child turns 3, the day they turn 3, they are now under IDEA Part B, which is Early Childhood Special Education Services, and that body of work is overseen by the Agency of Education and our public school system. And so the concerns that were coming up here is making sure that as we are thinking about separating 3 and 4-year-olds and moving 4-year-olds into public schools, what does that mean for having access to inclusive settings where children in those age ranges are able to be educated alongside their typically developing peers? In the least restrictive environment. And that's what's required by federal education law under IDEA. So that was another thing that came up.
Can you,
Sure.
I see 2 questions, and do you understand how the funding for EEE is different for the funding from CIS?
Yes, and so I don't want to spend time articulating that right now, but I do think it's really important to understand that these are separate funding mechanisms. They are separately administered. There's no question challenges associated with how we administer and implement and monitor those programs. And that is a federal challenge, not a Vermont challenge, right? And actually in my previous life, all of my research was on the transition from early intervention to special education and all of the challenges for families and for the system in administering those pieces. So I don't think we're trying to solve that problem in this series of bills, which is great. And it's really just thinking about how we make sure we're providing equitable, inclusive access to both 3s and 4s.
Just building on that a little bit, could you talk a little bit about the SAG grants and sort of how that's working or not for some of our school communities?
Great question. So that is also a question, at least in this moment, for Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin when she comes in the room.
In the room, but
in the virtual room.
Behind you.
Okay, so
so she's listening to everything you say.
Hello, Janet. So it's a question for her. And one of the other ways that Building Bright Futures supports and builds capacity in state government is supporting some of those data efforts. And one of the things that we will be partnering on and have started to partner on is looking at the life course of the data for special accommodations grants to help understand where we are seeing impacts, what those trends are. And there's also support in that preschool development grant to help think critically about that. But I think the Deputy Commissioner can speak more about.
I mean, do you have any of the data now around kids who have sought access to care and were not enrolled due to limited access to funding for that childcare center to meet the unique needs of that child?
I hope I will be able to answer that in a few weeks, but I don't have that data right now. I would imagine that is something that Janet's team can speak to. And I think that's a part of the work we have to do, is to look at the system of services and what we're providing and what that means and who doesn't have access and what that means and what other resources and supports we are seeing.
When I do a quick skim of the feedback that you shared, I see a lot about equity in the context of how people are receiving services from CCFAP or from early care and education providers. Were there any conversations around equity in terms of how we fund CCFAP and pre-K? I know that like generally, there seems to be very little opportunities for people to like talk about good tax policy and like community meetings generally.
Yeah, I'm going to talk with some of my regional managers about what they are hearing specific to that question. We could even pose some of that question around equity in CCFAP. And what's interesting is in an ideal world, we're building systems where families don't have to see that level, right? That they are receiving such high quality wraparound care based on whatever their needs are, that they know they have access and they get access. And that they shouldn't have to necessarily understand, here are the 5 ways this is funded and who's administering. Like, we want to create this seamless system of support that they aren't struggling to navigate. So I think it's an important question to ask is what their understanding is of that and who has equitable access. I imagine that our program directors and folks who are providing services would be able to speak to some of that as well. And it's a good line of inquiry. And my hope is that what we're moving towards is that seamless navigation where families don't have to know and we are able to meet their needs regardless of any of those pieces.
Yeah.
I had a question about when IDEA is triggered, the jurisdiction of it. Does it apply all the way from birth?
So it depends on the state in some cases. So some states actually allow families to access IDEA services, for children who are born prematurely, for example. Vermont is not currently one of those states, but there are opportunities, yes, to receive services at birth. And I am channeling some of my parent-child centers and some of our CIS providers who would say, we also are talking about prenatal to age 8. And really, when we're talking about a comprehensive system of early childhood services, that we should be talking about how we're supporting the family and the mom in that period to be able to make sure that we're giving them the resources to bring a child into that world. So from an IDEA specific perspective, I'm going to go back and ask that question to some of our CIS partners to know exactly what that date is. But we do talk about birth through age 3 for IDEA Part C, which is the early intervention children's integrated services part.
Okay, so I figured that a different way. So we could be doing it for preemies, but we don't in Vermont. But you are, even though we say prenatal. And then
I said prenatal. As a system, our goal is prenatal, but
Building Bright Futures is
correct.
prenatal too.
Mhm.
All right, 8.
Yes.
So when it's triggered or when we would decide to do it, what does that bring us? Does it bring us requirements and funds or just requirements, or I'm not sure.
So
I can't remember.
great question. So states across the country have different models for determining the eligibility for IDEA services. And one of the eligibility categories that they could choose to offer but don't have to is services for children who are born prematurely. And again, I would absolutely talk with the Children's Integrated Services team about this and what they are currently doing, but
Not stuck on the premature part. That I understood.
okay.
The part that I don't understand is it once kids are born now, are we?
That's a great question. I'm not sure whether or not IDEA services in Vermont start only when a child's born, but we provide other wraparound supports like some of the home visiting programs. The parent-child centers are absolutely doing work with families earlier than when a child is born, as is, I believe, CIS. But again, I don't want to speak incorrectly about that. So that's a question for the CIS team and maybe Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin.
All right, so now that I'm understanding this a little better, then I would just say, what would it mean if we were to let it trigger at what ages, and how would it help us, help children, help the state, help with funding, help in any way?
A great question. So the funding is federally administered and is provided to the state for a cohort of children based on the population needs. And I would say, again, I would ask the Children's Integrated Services team and the Deputy Commissioner to speak a little bit more about that, because they absolutely understand what the needs of those kids and families are, as well as what we might not be able to meet currently. And I think it's really important to hear from them about what those needs are.
And the Deputy Commissioners
And
speaking next.
Yes. All right.
Any other questions, thoughts for Dr. Crossman? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
thank you for having me. Happy to be a resource. And I also have hard copies if anybody wants them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin, hello. Thank you for coming back to join us after we sent you down a fire escape last.
That was an adventure. It was a view I hadn't seen before. So.
So I'd love to just jump back in wherever you were in your presentation, if you don't.
Yes.
And then we'll take a few minutes for questions.
Okay, great. I'm happy to do that. And yes, I was definitely listening to Dr. Crossman's testimony and gathering some of the questions, of which some of them I have a little bit of an inkling of, and some of them I really would need to go back and check with my team on. I think what you'll find is coming into this role, I have been working really deeply in the early childhood education system for the last 8 years. So I'm bringing in some existing knowledge on those pieces of it. But I had less direct experience with children's integrated services and the early intervention work. That's a critical part of our mission. And so I was still getting up to speed on that. Let me share my screen. Oh, I went to the beginning again. that myself. Okay. So I think this is where we stopped, right, yesterday.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Right. And so we had, but I think we'd gone through most of this in terms of just sort of, this is the current payment structure right now. And so the next thing I wanted to share with you was around, just to give you guys a sense of the usage of the program and what the uptake is right now. So we have, so this chart is, again, is a little bit of a little complex, right? But hopefully you can sort of follow it on the, right, infant, I'm realizing the age categories are not by age, they're by alphabetically, which is an improvement for the future. But the different age categories are on the left. Then you can see the federal poverty levels and the associated family share, weekly family share on the, across the top, and then the number of children that are enrolled. And go ahead.
And how many people are in Vermont? How many children are currently accessing regulated care right now?
Yes. So so our licensed capacity right now is about 34,000 spaces, and the desired enrolled capacity, the amount of that early childhood education programs and after school programs actually want to enroll is closer to 28,000. Programs and I have some slides a little later that give that, but yes. So it's about 20 to 25% of childcare capacity in the state is used by children who are receiving childcare financial assistance.
Thank you.
Okay. Another interesting piece to see here, right, is that 60% of the caseload has a $0 family share. So they are either families that are under 150% of the federal poverty level and have the service needs that we talked about yesterday, or they're fitting in some other eligibility category that we maybe, and they could be under 150%, or they could potentially be higher. And those other eligibility categories that we covered briefly yesterday were about being in participating in Reach Up, either the child or the parent have a specialized health need that childcare was important for them having an open case with family services, or this the family experiencing significant stress. So there's which is a family, we call it family support childcare, and that is aims to be sort of the catch-all for families that maybe don't categorize, don't qualify under another category, but are, have a real significant need. And that might have come up really quickly that they need to, that we just need to take care of it really quickly to make sure that kid can stay in quality care. Right.
In the second to last column, the 325 of poverty level 350, the fact that there are only 34 children there it's safe to assume that there are a lot more than 34 children who are actually in that income range and in care. It's just that the families aren't enrolling in CCFAP for whatever reason.
That's right. Well, that 325 to 350 was added in July of this past year. And so one is that it's a new program. It's a new, it was an addition. And so some of those are families that didn't qualify maybe when they first enrolled their child. I know that many, we tried to do outreach. I know many childcare programs really shared the updated eligibility guidelines. But it is partially that it may not have caught some of the younger children right as they were entering the system. So that part is new, and that's something to consider as we consider expanding the eligibility guidelines, how long it will take that uptake to actually come through. The other thing to keep in mind for some of these bans is that and also on this case, right, if the benefit, the family share is still $200 and maybe the program charges, it's a family childcare program that maybe only charges $250 a week. Or you're using it in a part-time basis, maybe it's not you don't feel like the benefit is worth the paperwork and you know, being part of a government program in that way.
Thank you.
The other thing I would say is these bands, just so you know, like they're relatively small, right? Like, you know, for a family of 3, each of these bands is like $500 or $600 worth of income each time. So you wouldn't expect to see a huge number of people in any given band because they are pretty tight. So I think, yeah, that's, I think, useful to just understand the lay of the land there. I do have some slides on Head Start, which I think was one of the questions. Do you guys want me to spend time on that?
I think we're particularly interested in Head Start in the context of how money comes into the state and how the revenue from Head Start might be part of the overall picture of how we're funding early care and education.
Okay. Okay, I have a few more slides now, but I will speed through a couple of them. But the highest level, right, is that, right, Head Start is a program, right, for low income, you know, typically for very low income families, or those, you know, with some other like really pretty significant service need. And it primarily serves 3- and 4-year-olds, though Head Start, you know, Start programs are starting to explore with other models and other partners, with other models that serve children that are younger or doing home visiting. But this, like the bread and butter, is the 3- and 4-year-old center-based care still. Head Start is a direct federal to local funding stream, right? So community organizations are applying directly to the Federal Office of Head Start to receive the Head Start funds. So right now there are 7 grant recipients, 7 organizations that are grant recipients, and then they offer services at 65 sites around that are offering the childcare. And then there's 11 that are sort of offering some home-based services. And again, that's where I'm saying they're sort of doing some of that experimentation. So I think, so that's high level there. I think another piece to know about Head Start is that, again, it is offering a high quality early childhood education experience, but intrinsic in the Head Start model is all sorts of like wraparound supports and family engagement and, you know, connection with healthcare services, like vision, you know, all sorts of like the, you know, dental support, like vision and hearing screenings. So it's a very robust program. It includes things that are not included and certainly not funded in other childcare settings.
And so to understand in the context of sort of our funding structure, are you saying that the money goes directly to those programs from the feds?
Yes.
And then the children served by those programs are sort of children that we don't need to count in children we need to fund otherwise?
Well, that's not quite true. So that's what I'm trying to say in this slide, right? Because that's not true. Because I'm saying the money, yes, it covers what is, you know, an early childhood education experience. What we you know, it does cover about 4 hours a day of that for those children as part of those grants. But Head Start also has the model and the mandate, you know, from the feds, also has a whole bunch of additional wraparound supports that it also needs to pay for with that money. So I just want to say, like, you can't just say, oh, Head Start's getting this much money, deduct, you know, that is all essentially CCFAP, because they have a bunch of other stuff that they have to pay for with that money too. And so this slide, I think, gets at a little bit of what those, the way that Head Start programs are sort of, you know, stacking these resources or sort of grading and blending the funding. And so that you can see that the Head Start on the left, the sort of bar chart shows, right, for the Head Start funding would cover about 4 hours a day of the childcare specific type services. Then if it's a 3- and 4-year-old, they would also be eligible for universal pre-kindergarten. So during that, during the school year, for that 10 hours of the universal pre-kindergarten funds, Head Start programs draw that down to cover 2 more hours of the day. And then they can if a family has needs additional hours, and many do, they can also apply for CCFAP, and CCFAP would issue, we would issue a part-time certificate to cover those additional hours. So Head Start programs are are using all of those fundings, and then you can also see that then for the programs that are serving younger children, there's not as many, but there are places where it is in the 0 to 3 age. There is it's just a combination of the Head Start dollars and CCFAP.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Would migrant children qualify for Head Start?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where did you say the certificate was from?
I was saying from the Child Development Division for the Child Care Financial Assistance Program.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Back to you.
Okay. And I think that all of these points I just made, so I think we're okay. I have a little bit of trend data that I think will be interesting for you to see. So, yeah. So you can see that right there, before 2020, there was, a gradual decline in the number of children utilizing CCFAP. And then there's been a big drop off, obviously with the pandemic, that we have not fully, that we haven't recovered from. I think we don't know exactly why that is, but it's useful to know that it is happening. I do think the hypothesis in terms of sort of why there's been the steady decline really was that sort of that the family incentive to participate was lower as the amount of the benefit that CCFAP was providing was covering less and less of the total cost of childcare for that family. And so that is why, we proposed and proposed a redesign of how CCFAP is funded. And that's what you guys saw now with that weekly family share. That makes it a lot clearer for families in terms of how much they're going to pay, and also really supports families that have more than one child. So that new model was put in place to sort of try to address that overall downward trend. There also, as people know, and then the other issue, right, I think really is childcare capacity. And I think that especially is why we're not seeing that bump up in 2023. And it's not necessarily, it's really, in talking with programs, the research is showing that, it's like 80 to 90% of programs are saying they're not opening all their spots right now because they don't have the workforce. So I think it's probably the most likely, reason why we're not seeing that uptick now in 2023 is tied to the capacity concerns. And there may also, it probably is also tied somewhat to different patterns in how people are working and recognizing where people are working from home. And, there may be some flexibility that's available to some workers now that is allowing them to, manage their childcare needs differently, but we don't know exactly. We can't say for certain, I guess I would say, which way that works.
Representative Bodie?
Thanks. Maybe you said this, but what percentage of children that actually exist were served in 2015 versus 2023?
Let's see. I'm trying to think about how to answer that question. I mean, in terms of the number of children that exist, right, we typically, this is typically sort of a 6-ish year, 5.5 to 6 year age cohort, right? And there's about 5,000 kids per year. So there's between.
There's about 25,000 kids in this.
Yeah, probably 30,000, but yeah.
Okay.
In terms of, sorry. CCFEP also serves school-age children. So that is one of the complications for that math I was just doing. That doesn't work. I'm used to being in a 0 to
And
5.
we shouldn't ask you to do.
So I can't do the math on my head right now. Yep.
Anyway,
I don't know the answer, but I can kind of find out. But again, the analysis that we did around existing spots before had been right now is that we're using 20 to that existing spots have about 20 to 25% of them are used by children that receive.
I think what would be helpful for us to see at some point, if we could, is a graph like this that doesn't include the school age CCFAP kids.
Okay.
Representative?
I will. Okay.
If I'm understanding Rep. O's question, I think I would find it interesting to see this with another line that shows like how those numbers are in terms of percent of total kids enrolled, to kind of understand whether the trend line is, as you say, maybe part of the reason we're sort of staying static now is because it's a consistent percent of kids enrolled because there aren't that many slots, or has the percent of kids receiving CCFAP changed over time?
And we can absolutely ask Joyce and Nolan in our joint fiscal office to make that graph for us. You don't have to do it if they have the same data that you're working from here, which I think they do.
Yeah, because I think the next slides actually provide the base data to make that. So.
Great.
Yeah.
So we will follow up with them and ask for it. You do not need to do that.
Okay. So I guess I have this is a series of 3 slides to make us a point, or just like to provide some background information, I guess, for you guys as you're thinking about this. But it's just around, again, licensed childcare capacity officially has been steady over the last 6 years, right? This is the number of slots that are licensed, that our licensors have gone out and said, your program can safely operate to serve this many children, given your physical capacity. So you can see that is like a real steady chart over the last 6 years. With a couple of up and downs, but it's really pretty steady. This slide is showing the reported desired capacity, which has had definitely some ups and downs, and you can see it within specific age. You can see it across the different ages as well. And again, this is the amount that a program is self-reporting in terms of how many children they actually want to serve. So it may be that somebody's licensed to serve 100 children, but they've decided that based on their their program philosophy, their quality standards, the staffing pattern that they'd like to run, they have decided to serve 80 children. Or maybe based on what they see as the need in their community. But most people would ask to be licensed for the max that they're legally allowed to, right? So that then they have flexibility underneath that. So we do try to collect this information from programs there. So, it's interesting to see that, between 2019 and 2020, like we were actually starting to make some progress, like on infant and toddler capacity. And that was a time that, the state, but the administration and legislature partnered together to make some investments in infant and toddler capacity. And then that has, fallen off, that after with the pandemic, it's really fallen off, and we need to continue to work there, or regroup our efforts there. And then the next slide that I'll show, I think is also relevant, because this talks about the number of childcare programs. And so, right, the key thing to keep in mind, right, is the number of childcare programs and the capacity that we have. They are linked, but they are not the same thing. So we saw licensed capacity is fairly steady. Desired enrollment kind of had been starting to go up, has going back down, varies by age. And then when we look at the number of childcare programs, there are fewer, and it is essentially entirely driven by the decline in the number of registered family childcare homes. And this is a national trend. So it is not just a Vermont problem, it's not just a Vermont issue. All over the country, there are fewer family childcare homes. Many of them the numbers are declining even faster than the numbers that there are here in Vermont. This is an area where we really know is really, really important for our rural communities, to be able to serve young children, to serve them close to home, to serve them in ways that are comfortable for the families. So it's definitely an area where we need to, again, like redouble our efforts in terms of growing those programs. I would also offer, though, it's tricky, right? The profile of the person who started a family childcare home 30 years ago, who is the person who's retiring now. Because what's happening right now is that the rate of retirement or closure is pretty steady. That's not what the issue is. And there's always going to be churn in family childcare homes, right? They're going to open, they're going to close. Like, these are attached to people's personal homes and their lives. And so the rate of closure is pretty steady, but but we're not opening new programs fast enough to make up for that decline. And again, when you think about the profile of the person who sort of starts a family childcare home, 30 years ago, it was, right, a person who, typically a couple in whom one partner has, a steady job with health insurance that they feel like they can count on, and they own their own home, as they're starting their family. And that there's just not that many people that meet that definition anymore. So we have to really think about how, what it will take to actually incent people to start family childcare homes right now. So those are
that's great. Thank you.
So that's what I had to share with you guys.
Thanks. Are there any other questions that came up with Dr. Crossman that we want to ask Janet? Yeah, Catherine.
Thank you for all this, Janet. Just wanted to follow up about the SAG grants and hoping you could explain a little bit more about what they are, and what you're hearing from providers.
Yeah, right. So so again, this is a place where, again, I'm still learning, and I'm happy we'll check back with my team. But right, special accommodation grants, right, are places where a early childhood education program or any childcare program can apply to have a grant to hire an aide for a child with a specific need. And that process has been, I think there's both internally and externally, everybody recognizes that process has been like, it's not timely enough. The money's not enough. Like, it's not meeting the full need to make sure that our goals around including all children with all disabilities or of all abilities are included in the way that they need to be. And it has really been limited by, I guess I would say in the past that one of the key variables has been the amount of money that's available to offer the special accommodation grants. And that has really been the biggest problem in the past, is that there's just not enough money, which has resulted in a process of, it's not designed as it's not an entitlement right now, right? And so we, I think, have prioritized this area. It is an area where ARPA dollars, were highlighted and are being used, in a way that like doubled the amount of money in this program. The state also recently received a preschool development Birth to 5 grant from the feds. And there is, hundreds of thousands of dollars from that grant that are going to be dedicated to increasing the amount of resources available for special accommodation grants. So I would say the absolute biggest barrier in the past was just how much money we had for the program. So now at least we're kind of moving beyond just there's no money to okay, how do we actually make the process better for families and for childcare programs? And so we have recently centralized sort of the application process that allows and have a monthly review. So that allows for a much more timely turnaround. Before it was just twice a year, and have I think, streamline the application some. And I think that there is absolutely more work to do and recognized by our team and all of our Children's and Youth Services partners to enhance the process, to streamline it further and to figure out how else we can modify the program. And another piece of this is really wanting to make sure that that the programs are, anyway, so that's it, actually. Sorry.
Thanks, and for all that, and certainly agree that, you know, I've heard from childcare providers in my community that there's both the amount of funding and the kind of, you know, additional administrative burden of applying for funds, and also the short-term commitment, right? If an infant seeks to enroll in a childcare center and they offer all the way through UPK, that's a kind of multi-year commitment to that child and family. And the grants, I believe, are they 1-year grants?
I think they can be up to 6. There's 6 or 12 months. Yeah, I can't remember. Sorry.
And so that can put a center in a kind of tricky position of committing to a child and family without you know, long-term availability of resources to meet the needs of that kid and family. And I think it is interesting, kind of from an equity and access perspective, how kind of different that is than our current you know, public schools, where any family you know, is you know, a school is obligated to serve all families who seek access to education, and you know, we are not able to honor that commitment necessarily at our childcare center. And you know, I heard directly from one childcare center that, you know, this felt like an awful position to be put in, where, you know, a family seeks care, the childcare center would like to provide that access to care. They do not have the current staff capacity or facility to meet the needs of that kid, and have had to turn away kids because of a lack of access to funding. And you know, when you're, you know, and I strongly believe that most of our centers want to serve everyone at the best of their ability, and how heartbreaking is that to say no in a way that, frankly, is, you know, illegal for our public schools to do.
So there was a huge amount of money with ARPA dollars that came through CDD, and I think you've had various experiences administering that money. I'm curious, you know, there are various timelines and various bills that are floating around this building, but all of them look at significantly expanding eligibility for CCFAP, which will significantly expand the work of your department. And I'm curious to hear from you about sort of timelines that you think that you all are going to need. I'm sure you've answered this question in 5 other committees already, but timelines that you will need to be able to meet those needs and really like purposefully increase demand from your department, both in terms of the new support needed for programs, but also, like, you know, just so many more families coming through.
Let's see, I would say our proposal does include, you know, additional resources for the community childcare support agencies that we talked about yesterday. And that, you know, we will absolutely need, you know, the governor's proposal does include an increase in eligibility, and recognizing that those entities are really essential, and that we need to increase those resources. I think there are a couple other of the grant programs that are contemplated in the in S56 H208 that the staffing resources were not contemplated as the proposals were put together. And so that's a conversation that we're actively in right now with the governor's office, with our team, with the governor's office, with JFO, with the committees that are looking at the around what would be the position needs to support.
And I'm actually less interested in the position needs, because that's not as much, that's a little bit our problem, and that JFO will need to include it in any revenue we would need to raise. I'm more interested in timelines, because we won't need, like, there's no point in us raising revenue for a program that you will not be able to administer in that year that we're raising that revenue. So, and you don't have to answer now, but yeah, would love to.
Let me, Yeah, I guess I feel like I'm not ready to answer that question right now.
That sounds
Sorry,
great.
that's my newness coming into play.
No, I don't think it is. I think it's that I tossed a fairly large question to you without
Okay.
letting you know in advance. But yeah, timelines for all of this are really, really particularly important to this committee. Because also revenues come in at different speeds as well. And we want to make sure that we're building out a timeline that is at the appropriate speed.
Yep.
Thank you. Representative Bodie.
I don't know where this fits in, but what if a grant followed the child and was not yearly? So you make a commitment both to the child and the center. And then we also know how to deal with the funding that way, but then regarding what Representative Sims was saying, and there's certainty in the structure of the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that those are, I would be shocked if these were not questions that our team is sort of grappling with. And I don't know how that, the tie between funding source and the ability to make multi-year commitments. I also think that, oftentimes the goal, it really depends on what the need is, but oftentimes the goal is to actually, move a child away from needing individual aid, right? If you can get them the developmental supports and services that they need, then ideally they wouldn't need that on a multi-year basis. Again, it's, a child with like a feeding tube is like a different question, right? So, again, I think there's real experts on my team that, can engage in sort of those like specific conversations, but I think it's a valid point.
Anyone else? Any questions? Okay. Anything else you want to share with us?
Oh, I think I'm good.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you all.
Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's anything you've been wanting to add from the sidelines as we've talked through all these things here. Okay, great.
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. We are done for the week. With being in this room in these chairs. I imagine everyone has other work to do on various bills. And then we're gonna have 2 bills probably up next week. The charter change and then the TIF and veggie bill. And with
Charter change on notice today?
I think it was on notice
It was on notice,
today.
yeah.
Yes, it was on notice today, so Tuesday. Yeah. Okay.